You already know this story. A hungry crowd with nowhere to eat, a boy's tiny lunch, and somehow thousands of people go home full, with baskets left over. It is the only miracle that all four gospel writers stop to record. Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, every one of them refused to let us forget it. And yet most of us have flattened the whole thing into a single line. Jesus multiplied the food, a nice miracle, proof he can provide, and we move on. But this was never really a story about lunch. Underneath the familiar version is a whole layer of meaning that most of us read straight past every single time. Welcome to Explaining Lost Pages. I'm Nathan Cole, and tonight I want to slow this story all the way down until you can see what Jesus was actually doing. Because he was not solving a catering problem. He was performing a sign and acted out sermon, and he loaded it with details that point far beyond a full stomach. So here's what I'll show you: why it had to be barley and not wheat, why a child's lunch and not a rich man's storehouse, what four small words are really pointing to. And by the end, one question: who is this man on the hillside? Hold on to it, because the answer is bigger than the miracle itself. This is not a story about a snack. It is one of the most layered, loaded moments in all four Gospels, a scene where every number and every crumb is doing theological work. So keep that question open the whole way through. Who is this? We'll come back to it, but to understand the sign, we have to start somewhere unexpected, with grief. Because right before this miracle, something terrible has happened, and the Gospels want us to feel the weight of it before we ever see the bread. John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, the man who prepared the way for him, has just been executed, killed in a palace on a whim to save a king's pride at a party. A dance, a rash oath, a cruel request, and John's head is carried out of the dungeon on a platter to satisfy a grudge. John's own disciples come, take his body and bury it, and then they go and tell Jesus what has happened. And Jesus does what any grieving person longs to do. He pulls away. He gets into a boat to cross the water toward a lonely, deserted place. He is looking for room to breathe, room to mourn a man who was family, room to be quiet with his Father before the storm of ministry closes back in. Hold that in your mind. The miracle we're about to see does not come from a rested, comfortable man. It comes from someone carrying real sorrow. And that matters because it tells you the kind of God he is, one who pours out for others precisely when he himself has the least left to give. But the crowds see him leave, and on foot around the shore they run ahead of the boat, thousands of them, hungry not for bread yet, but for him. So when Jesus steps out onto the shore, there is no solitude waiting for him. There is a sea of desperate, exhausted, needy people who would not leave him alone. And here is the thing that undoes me: he does not sigh, he does not turn the boat around. Scripture says he looks at them and is moved with compassion. They are, he says, like sheep without a shepherd, scattered, leaderless, unprotected. Hold that image of the shepherd. It comes back later in a way you won't expect. So instead of resting, he begins to teach them. He heals their sick. He gives and gives hour after hour while his own grief waits in the background. And slowly, quietly, the light starts to lean toward evening, the shadows stretch, and a very ordinary problem begins to grow underneath the whole scene. Thousands of people, the middle of nowhere, the sun going down, and not a scrap of food anywhere in sight. The disciples see it coming. They come to Jesus with a sensible plan: send the crowds away now while there's still time to reach the villages and buy food. And Jesus answers with a line that must have stopped them cold. They do not need to go away, you give them something to eat. John's Gospel adds a detail the others don't. Jesus said this to test them because he already knew exactly what he was going to do. So this was never really a crisis for him. It was a classroom. The impossible situation was the lesson, and the disciples were about to fail the first question. Philip does the math out loud. Even 8 months' wages, 200 denarii, wouldn't buy enough bread for each person here to get a single bite. 200 denarii, a small fortune, and it still wouldn't be enough. This isn't just difficult. By every honest measure, it is flatly impossible. Then Andrew speaks up, half hopeful and half embarrassed. "There's a boy here," he says. "He has 5 small barley loaves and 2 little fish." And then he says the quiet part out loud. "But what are these for so many?" You can hear the hope collapse in the same breath that offered it. A boy's lunch against a sea of thousands. It is almost laughable. Hand it out and it vanishes in the first row and changes nothing. But here is what I don't want you to miss. This exact moment when the resources run out and the math dies is precisely where Jesus does his best work. The disciples looked at the loaves and they counted. 5, 2, not enough. They measured the size of the need against the size of the supply, and the supply lost. And that is so often exactly what we do. We take our small, honest offering, hold it up against the size of the problem, and quietly decide it's pointless. But scarcity is only the end of the story if the loaves stay in our hands. Everything changes the moment they are placed in His. Because the problem was never the size of the lunch. The problem was that everyone was still measuring it by what they could do with it. So watch closely what He actually does with it, because He is about to turn a boy's lunch into a sermon that has fed the church for 2,000 years. And before we get to His hands, if this slow, careful way of reading Scripture is what you're here for, take 1 second to subscribe. It genuinely helps us keep going deeper. Now the Gospels could have simply said bread, but John stops to tell us it was barley, 5 barley loaves, and that one word is carrying a lot of weight. Barley was the grain of the poor, cheap, coarse, the bread you ate when wheat was out of reach. It was the food of laborers and the hungry, never of the wealthy. So notice the choice. He does not reach for a rich patron's storehouse of fine white wheat. He reaches for the plainest bread there is in the hands of a child. Not the powerful, not the impressive, not the abundant, the small, the poor, the overlooked. That is what He picks up to work the miracle. And that is not an accident, because it is exactly how God tends to work all through Scripture. He chooses the little thing the world would pass over. The younger brother, the barren woman, the shepherd boy, the unimpressive lunch. God keeps reaching for what looks like not enough and calling it His starting point. And if you know your Old Testament, this hillside should feel familiar, because it had happened before on a smaller scale centuries earlier. A man once brought the prophet Elisha 20 barley loaves in a time of famine, and Elisha said, "Give it to the 100 men to eat." His servant said the same thing the disciples would later say, "How can this feed so many?" And the answer came, "They will eat and have some left over." And they did. So the crowd on that hillside is sitting inside an echo. Barley loaves, an impossible number, a prophet who feeds them anyway, and now someone greater than Elisha is here. But first, the boy, he could have kept quiet. He could have eaten his own lunch in a corner and let the hungry crowd be someone else's problem. Instead, he hands over everything he has, his whole meal, to a man who might waste it. And that small act of surrender is the door the miracle walks through. Now watch the 4 words. The Gospel says He took the loaves, He looked up to heaven, He blessed them, He broke them, and He gave them out. Took, blessed, broke, gave, 4 small verbs, and if they sound familiar, they should, because you have heard them somewhere else at a very different table. On the last night before He died in an upper room, Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to His friends, saying, "This is my body given for you." The exact same pattern, the identical 4 movements, on a hillside with a boy's lunch and in an upper room with His own life. Took, blessed, broke, gave. That is not a coincidence. The feeding of the crowd is quietly rehearsing the meal that would explain His death. The loaves are a first sketch of the cross. So the bread is blessed and broken, and it begins to move, hand to hand, row to row, out across the entire hillside into thousands of waiting palms. And it does not run out, it keeps coming. The baskets never hit the bottom. Somewhere between His hands and theirs, the impossible quietly becomes enough, and then more. But go back a step, because there's a detail almost everyone flies past. Before a single crumb is handed out, Jesus gives one strange, specific instruction. He tells them to sit down in groups, 50s and 100s, not a chaotic mob, an ordered arrangement like a people being formed into ranks. If that rings a bell, it should. because that is how Israel was arranged in the wilderness, camped in ordered ranks around the presence of God, being fed by his hand. And then the gospel adds 3 careful words about where they sat, not the dust, not the rocks. Mark tells us on the green grass. Green grass in a dry land at the end of a long day. And if that phrase wakes something up in you, it's because there is an old song about exactly this. A song about a shepherd who makes his sheep lie down in green pastures, who leads them beside still waters, who prepares a table for them in the middle of the wilderness. Whose cup overflows, whose people shall not want. Remember the crowd like sheep without a shepherd? On that green grass the shepherd has arrived and he is setting the table. Even the numbers are preaching. 5 loaves and 2 fish. 5 plus 2 is 7, and in the Bible, 7 is the number of fullness, of completion, of everything God finishes. So the very supply the disciples called not enough already added up in God's arithmetic to perfect fullness. Heaven was doing different math the whole time. And then comes the line that lands like a hammer. They all ate, and they were satisfied, not nibbling, not rationing, full. Thousands of people in the middle of nowhere with nothing between them, completely fed. And the story still isn't finished, because now he tells them to gather what's left. Gather up the fragments, he says, so that nothing is lost. Even here, in the middle of overflowing abundance, he will not waste a single broken piece. Hold that phrase too, nothing lost. It is going to matter enormously by the time we reach the end. And when they finish, they fill 12 baskets with the leftover fragments. Start with a boy's lunch. End with 12 baskets more than you began. That is his kind of abundance. And 12 is not a random number either. 12 tribes of Israel, 12 apostles, 12 baskets. The pattern keeps pointing in the same direction. It's a quiet hint that this bread, this shepherd, this abundance is meant for the whole people of God, every tribe, every table, with room to spare. One boy's surrendered lunch and there is enough left over to fill a basket for every tribe. Nobody planned that, nobody could except him. The very next morning, the crowd comes chasing him around the lake. They want more bread, and here is where he gently refuses to be misunderstood. You're looking for me, he tells them, not because you saw the sign, but because you ate the loaves and were filled. Don't work for the bread that spoils, work for the bread that lasts forever. And they push back with the very story we've been circling. Our ancestors ate manna in the wilderness, they say, bread that rained down from heaven. Moses gave them that. And Jesus corrects them carefully. It was not Moses who gave you the bread from heaven. It is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. And then he says the thing that changes everything. I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never hunger. Whoever believes in me will never thirst. The manna kept an entire generation alive in the desert, and still every one of them died. But this bread, he says, is different. Whoever eats it will live forever. And then the hardest, deepest words of all. The bread that I will give is my flesh, given for the life of the world. The bread has to be broken to feed the world. Remember the question I asked you to hold at the start? Who is this? Here it is. He is the true manna, the living bread that came down from heaven. Greater than Moses, greater than any prophet, greater than any miracle of full stomachs. The one the whole hillside, the barley, the numbers, the grass had been pointing to all along. And 2,000 years later, we are still being fed from that same hillside. Every time bread is broken at his table, the miracle is quietly still going on. So here's the invitation. You can grip your small lunch as tightly as you want and have exactly enough for yourself and no more, or you can hand it over. Your loaves don't have to be enough. They were never supposed to be. You just have to bring the little you have and put it into his hands and let him do the rest. Because he takes what is small, blesses it, breaks himself to feed a starving world, and gathers up every last fragment so that nothing and no one is ever lost. If you want to keep pulling on this thread with me, subscribe and we'll keep going deeper.